I think I want to start this conversation, which starts with death and dying, with a little bit of a reflection about Swami Kriyananda's recent passing. I was this morning on a radio interview that actually was emanating from the United States, so it was early this morning and late afternoon there. And it was based on the interviewer having seen the movie Finding Happiness, which many of you have seen or will see soon, about the Ananda communities and the way of life. And the interviewer asked a question, and she asked me, in your life at Ananda, what have been the hardest things that you've had to face? And she mentioned the fact, which is shown in that movie, that it was now many, many years ago, but in 1976, just a few years after the community started, there was a huge forest fire, and half our land and almost all our houses burned down. I didn't personally lose a house. I didn't have a house to lose. I had almost nothing to lose, but what little I had, I didn't. But she offered that as perhaps something hard that we had to go through. And I sort of thought for a moment, and I didn't mean to sound flippant, but I said, oh, the fire was fun. And even at the time, it was fun. No one was hurt. There was one firefighter his plane crashed, and he did die. I don't think he died on our land. He died nearby. But no one in the community was hurt. We all got away. All we lost was stuff, which is sometimes difficult to replace. But still, both at the time and in memory, it was a thrilling experience to be in the presence of something that just made your own life so obviously in the hands of God. When just speaking of that particular fire, things that happened a long time ago are still very real for the effect that they had. A forest fire is a unique event if you live out in the country in California. And if you go through big drought years, you have all this wild land that hasn't had any rain on it for many, many months. And these fires get started. This fire got started because a county machine threw a spark out into dry grass, and it just ignited. And in the afternoon there, the wind blows from a certain direction. So if the fire starts downhill with the wind behind it, it can just, raging inferno is the word they use. It can just really rush. So we stood at the height of our hill, looking way down into this valley of nothing but dry grass. The fire was burning. The wind was behind it. It's moving uphill. Heat rises, and so what it does is it dries out all the fuel that's in front of it. The heat of the fire dries everything even more, so it begins to rush, and it's an amazing experience. And it came up over the ridgetop, and all of our houses were in a very densely wooded area, and the trees were so close together. There's a phenomenon of fire which it'll go to the bottom of a tree, and if the tree is dry enough, it'll shoot right up. And then it goes along the tops of the trees, tree topping it's called, so it just goes so fast. Now, on one hand, of course, such a thing can be terrifying. And if you're running in front of it and grabbing for all your stuff, it can also be a very frenzied moment. On the other hand, it just reminds you how completely temporary our existence on this planet is, and how these forces can be just unleashed in an instant. And suddenly your little human ego and your little human ideas are just so small next to the power of God. And that's very exhilarating. I suppose it could be terrifying, but the other side of it is it's very exhilarating in a marvelously free sort of way. Master talks about our having the capacity to stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds. He was never one to make the challenge small, was he? And I don't know, I've never been in the crash of breaking worlds. But when you see these forces unleashed, you realize that our little human selves are just part of a much bigger reality that we need to keep in mind a lot more, both for our own well-being and especially for our spiritual happiness. I remember I was working in the publications building of Ananda village. This was in my first decade there, and the building was very primitive and quite permeable, and there were lots of creatures who came in and out. We had a family of bats living behind one of the pictures, and there were just mice and all sorts of stuff everywhere. And I was sitting at my desk one day, and the creature that I was watching was quite small. This was before computers, and I had an electric typewriter. And this tiny little spider had found his way onto my computer. And at least to my impression, he was a very gutsy and rather flamboyant little spider. And he moved very quickly, and he was whizzing across the space bar and then coming down the keys and then moving like this and then going up and sitting on the edge of things. And he was, every time he would stop, he would sort of survey his domain. And I'm watching him, and I'm realizing that his life is entirely in my hands. And even though he doesn't realize it, just in an instant, it could be the end of his incarnation. And I'm there just sort of playing God. And I also suddenly have this really strong feeling that there's a much bigger thumb than mine, and it's right above me. And it watched me come to work, and now it's sitting there at the desk, and it's trying to decide if at any moment it's just going to take my life away. And it was, again, a marvelously exhilarating moment. It's not that I don't love my life and am not attached to it. You know, this is the human condition in a certain way. But we're always moving in so much more of a fluid world. And so much of our suffering is because we just don't understand the conditions under which we live. Last April, as all of you know, Swami Kriyananda passed out into the infinite. When one of my friends, when her husband died rather suddenly, people would say often, "I'm so sorry you lost your husband." She took great exception to that language. She said, "You make it seem like I left my wallet in Macy's and he was in it." Macy's is a department store there. She said, he's not lost, she said. "I know exactly where he is. He's just not here," which of course is a very strong way to look at it. She also said the temptation to be sad was something she always had to fight against, because she knew where he was and he wasn't lost. He was right where he needed to be, but he wasn't with her anymore. Well, when Swamiji passed into the infinite in April, some of you have heard me say these things, but I'll reflect on them again here. It wasn't so much that I needed to be with him when he died. It's just that I always thought I would be. I always thought that we would have a kind of gracious warning period, and that many of us would gather, and there would be some kind of a cycle of time when we knew he was dying. In fact, the predicted end of his life was his birthday in 2009, and I took the trouble to go to India because I thought it might be his last birthday. And he actually, the day after his birthday, had a serious, it wasn't exactly a stroke, but a small seizure of some kind, and for quite a few weeks after that, he had so many ailments at that point that it would have been easy for him to slip away. So it didn't fulfill itself, but it might have. But in any case, he died without warning. I was sitting in my house at 11 o'clock at night, and the phone rings, and Devi says, "Kirtani just called and said Swami is having great difficulty breathing." I said, "What does that mean?" Devi said, "I don't know." And then she hung up the phone, and about 2 minutes later, Kirtani called and said that Swami was free. that he was gone. Just like that. 15 minutes, he got up, he had a little seizure, he had difficulty breathing, they stretched him out on the bed, and 15 minutes after that, he had just left his body. I mean, you've heard many people talk about this, and those who were there have talked about it. So there it was, and I had said many times over the last even 10 years that whenever Swami chose to exit his body, we couldn't say he didn't warn us. And he really warned us repeatedly that it was close to the end. And it would be unspeakably selfish to, in any way, resent the fact that he's not going to live forever. I would have voted that he be like Babaji, but he never asked us our opinion, and he was going to have a normal lifespan, not an extended yogic life. But I was just sort of thinking about his passing, and I had a very deep desire to understand what it felt like on his side. Now, I think I actually never finished answering about the interviewer this morning, because it's relevant to what I'm about to say. She was talking about the fire, and so I ended up telling you about the fire. So I had to really answer her question, what has been the most challenging and the hardest thing that I've had to face over all these years? I can't really seriously think of any of it as being hard, because all of it has been such fun. But I think the hardest thing has been that Swamiji has been such a perfect friend to me, to thousands of other people. He has been such a perfect example of unconditional love and complete acceptance of people, and therefore, and within that acceptance, an extraordinary ability to help people, to lift people up. And I said the hardest thing has been to realize that nothing less than that is enough for any of us, and to constantly be realizing the effort required to become as perfect a friend as he has been, to one another, to oneself. And even that I wouldn't consider hard in the sense of unpleasant, but that's the constant challenge, is to become as he is. That's why he was born to us, is so that we could see what a life lived for God looks like, and it gives us a constant point of measurement. Not a measurement that needs to make us feel inadequate, but a measurement that is exhilarating in the challenge that it presents. You know, every time you want to settle for some little tiny, oh, this time, in fact, they did mistreat me, and I'm justified in being angry. This time I can close my heart. This time I don't have to reach out and help this person. But always you remember that Swamiji never set a limit, and therefore that is the standard. All of Krishna's soldiers must become like Krishna. So here we are. Swamiji has passed away, and I wasn't sitting next to him as I thought I might be. Others were, and they talked about it. But I really wanted to feel it from his point of view. And I feel that he gave me a glimpse of it, and even if it wasn't really super conscious, this is the understanding that I came to. Shivani and Kirtani, who were present at the time, Shivani came immediately after. Shivani talked about the extraordinary stillness in the room. Right after Swami passed, he's stretched out on the bed, his heart has stopped, and he stopped breathing. And there was this just extraordinary lack of movement, lack of sound, lack of vibration, lack of meaning disturbed vibration. Everything was completely still. So I started thinking about just really the whole process of what happened for Swamiji. He had a seizure. It was difficult for him to breathe. He was lying on the bed, and others were urging him to breathe, trying to sort of see if it was his time. I want to give you another little piece of this, which I heard from Miriam recently in a talk she gave. Miriam was his nurse. when he had a very bad renal failure, his kidneys just were not working, and he doesn't like to go to the hospital. And I believe this happened in Pune, and he was in a hotel in the city of Pune, and it was a question of whether he had to go to the hospital. He didn't really want to go to the hospital. But when they did he didn't want to check into the hospital. When they tested him, basically the doctor said, his condition is so severe that if we don't treat him in the hospital right now, he won't live. And whether he lived or died, his death wasn't far away. So Miriam decided that she would ask him whether he wanted to go home or whether he wanted to stay in the hospital and be treated. And he made the decision that he wasn't quite finished yet. So he went into the hospital to be treated and then came out and lived perhaps almost another year and did wonderful work during that year. But apparently this was different, and that's why they were encouraging him to breathe, because they wanted to be sure that this was his moment and that he didn't have anything else to do. But soon it became obvious that he wasn't going to breathe anymore. So there was that moment, as it was described. He opened his eyes, he looked at Narayani, who was right close to him. He took one more breath, and then he let that out, and then he didn't breathe again. Now, this is what it is for all of us. Of course, I'm using Swamiji because it's so dramatic and it's so vivid, and all of us have such a deep involvement with his passing. But really, what he went through is what everyone goes through. There's a certain point in what keeps us in our bodies, in very simple terms. Our hearts keep beating, and the breath flows in, and the breath flows out. Now, by its very definition, this is movement, isn't it? We haven't come into the complete stillness of spirit. Now, the whole practice of Kriya Yoga and of serious meditation can bring us to the point where the breath stops and even where the heart stops. And we are in perfect stillness, but we still can reactivate the body. This is the I die daily that St. Paul spoke about, which was the gift of Christ consciousness. I die because I enter into perfect stillness. The very act of living is to be engaged in this vibration. Isn't that so? When the little newborn baby is born, we're having a small epidemic of babies being born in our Ananda village community. These little tiny babies are being born, and when the baby first comes out of the mother's womb, there is no certainty, of course, that incarnation will really go forward, and everybody waits for the first cry, because as soon as the baby inhales and cries, that's the beginning of the incarnation. Master said the baby cries because when it takes that first big breath, it realizes, here I am again. I'm in a material body, I'm in the material plane, and this whole agonizing cycle is starting all over again. They say astrologically, that's actually the moment of birth, is when that first breath and that first cry comes. Now, and from that moment, the heart is beating, the lungs are moving. And so we're always in some kind of a movement. And that, of course, is what makes our lives what they are. We're always being pushed. Inhalation, exhalation, inhalation, exhalation. That's the energy going up and down the spine that we try to work with in Kriya. Now, there's Swamiji. They're trying to pull him back, or at least give him the opportunity to come back. He takes one last look at Narayani, who's been taking care of him so carefully. He lets the breath out, and he doesn't take it back in again. Now, for anyone who's ever sat with anyone at the end of their life, and I wasn't there with Swamiji, but I have had the privilege of being with a few other people in just exactly that moment. And that extraordinary waiting, each time if a person is laboring to breathe, when my father died in his 80s, my brother and sister and I were sitting with him, and he had faded. He was elderly, his mind was not entirely clear, and he just, at a certain point, he just lay down and he wasn't going to get up. And it was perfectly fine. We were all in agreement that we would just let him pass. Very sweetly, the last words he spoke were to someone who helped him, and he said, "Thank you." And then he never said anything else again. And we sat for about 2 days. And it just began to be that vigil of just listening to him breathe. And then the pauses between the breath, and then that shift that happens at the end of life, where at first there's a struggle to breathe in. The breath is like that. And every time they keep trying to take breath in, and it's a struggle. And then there's a shift where, if you're ever sitting with someone, where the effort goes toward breathing out. And it's like they're trying to expel the life force instead of taking it in. And as soon as you hear that shift, I'm no medical person, my experience is small, but I've seen it every time. As soon as they try to expel the breath, the end is really close, especially if the rhythm has been going on a long time. And I sat there with my father, and he finally pushed out his last breath. And I must say, an overwhelming joy accompanied that. I just sort of felt him reunited with my mother, who had died 2 years earlier, and just the spirit being free. In fact, I was so happy that when all the people in the place where he'd been living for a couple of years came and they expressed their regrets, and he was very sweet, some of them were weeping, I was laughing and smiling so much. My sister finally just had to punch me in the ribs and tell me to just move out of the center of the picture a little bit. But I couldn't feel any other way. He just let it go. And that's the same reality. His breath stopped and his heart stopped. Now, with Swamiji, I was just picturing him, just being there. His heart's just barely beating. There's just an occasional breath. And then all of a sudden, what happens is he simply enters into absolute stillness. All that duality which breath and heartbeat represents, it's over. And I had this picture when I prayed to him to show me what this was like for him. And I thought of the great ocean. And I've done a little bit of scuba diving or even just snorkeling. And if you ever go into the ocean with goggles on and kind of float in the water, you can find a point where your eyes are just at the line where you're in and out of the ocean. And you can sort of look up, and there's this whole world that happens here, and you go down, and there's this vast world that happens here. And they're right next to each other, but they're just entirely different universes, the above and below water. So I had this picture of Swamiji as the vast ocean of spirit. And the ocean of spirit, even in the physical ocean, it has no end. It's just this vast ocean of spirit. The difference being for him is that even when he was living in this physical body, his consciousness was not confined to this physical body. He moved it around, but it was just the most condensed point of this enormous reality. That's how Master described his own consciousness. He was the infinite ocean, and the more advanced a soul is, the closer it stays to the whole ocean. So I had this feeling of Swamiji as just the infinite ocean, and then there had been this little wave. It was more like a little trap door. This little trap door opened on the surface of the water, and while that trap door was open, this infinite consciousness could come out through that trap door. Now, most of us living here, not in the ocean, but here, experience this enormous flow of infinity through this little trap door, and that's where we sat and related to him. Just all these years we sat in front of him, and the ocean flowing through him was so delightful that a vast, vast number of people all over the planet sat there and watched. And then when he was done, and the last breath went, I felt like the difference for him was just the tiniest relaxation of that tiny little opening. And then everything just went back into the ocean. From our side, when that tiny little door went down, seemingly this enormous thing had happened. And it felt enormous, and on a certain level, it was. And on a certain level, it's nothing at all. Now, Swami's death is not only, an event that will mark us forever. 2013 as a year, will always be the year that he passed away and that everything became different. But in just the same way that I was saying that his unconditional friendship and his compassionate ability to help so many people in so many ways set the standard for all of us, so does the nature of his passing set the standard for all of us when it comes to that part of our life as well. And Master himself also left this earth with the same kind of just easy release. Master had said years before, a heart attack is the easiest way to die. That's how I choose to go. And as you know, Master was standing and speaking, and he finished his speech. He finished his poem. And then when he finished his poem, he just stopped his heart. There was a sigh. And then everything went back to stillness. That little bit of a force that had entered into duality for our sake just went back to one. Now, as effortlessly and as easily and as beautifully as these masters slip away, this is the standard for all of us. And one of the realities that the path of self-realization, the ascending age of consciousness, really puts upon us is that we need to accept all of reality in a much different way. I was talking earlier today with Daljit, who of course is in the business of running a hospital, and we were talking about health care in America and health care in other parts of the world. And there's a common statistic in America that 70% of every health dollar is spent in the last 6 months of a person's life. And they say to extend that life by an average of 21 days. And it's been asserted that in America, the entire healthcare crisis is entirely because of that. Because people are completely unwilling to just participate with grace in the fact that eventually duality ceases in terms of the body, the heart stops, the breath goes out. I saw a video on television that was a group of doctors who were trying to bring about a different understanding about death and understanding how distorted the end-of-life care can be. And one of the doctors said, we just need to sit with our patients and say, you are mortal, get over it. Just like that. But there's really truth in that. And you see, we miss so much when we have this extreme anxiety about the end of life. Because, first of all, it's going to happen to all of us. And it's very important to live in this world with an awareness of that coming. Because otherwise, we can miss the point. It's everybody says it. But how often do we really live by that? That whatever we have in this world there's no way you can hold on to it. If you've ever had the opportunity to see someone's body after the soul is gone, I mean, it's usually not very pretty. Sometimes faces are really beautiful. Swamiji looked just beautiful and serene, just really just resting so gorgeously. When I was in seclusion a few weeks after his passing, I looked at his picture, had a little conversation. I said, Swamiji, how am I going to get along now that you're gone? It was just that feeling. I sort of feel like he's held my kite string. And I could float around and be as loony as I wanted to because he was always holding the kite string. A little bit of fear that if nobody's holding the kite string, what might happen? I said, what am I going to do now that you're gone? It's clear as if he were sitting next to me. I heard him say, what makes you think I'm gone? Perfect answer. I answered back because I'm a little cheeky. Sir, I went to Italy and your body was in a casket and it was there for like more than a week. That gave me the impression that you were gone. And he answered me. He says, what does that have to do with me? And that was when I asked him, well, then tell me what it is like for you. What does that have to do with me? Yes, of course, that which, we all knew as Kriyananda was lying there for a long time. And it was still. But what does that have to do with me, he said. So I've been looking at this that I live in and asking myself, what does this really have to do with me? And see, the part of that that's so interesting, I remember I was in Rome when my mother died. I had just left a day or so before, and she'd been ill with Parkinson's for a long time, but her death came quite suddenly. And my sister called me and said, Mom has died. And I said, just the first thing out of my mouth, now you have to understand, she was very ill with Parkinson's and had been for 15 years. And it was really beginning to get difficult. She was having seizures and so on. My sister said, Mom has died. I said, oh, good for her. And, fortunately, my sister is a Kriyaban, and she understood exactly what I meant. Good for her. The moment came, and she just let it go. She didn't fight, she didn't cling, she just let it go. It was done. What does this have to do with me? And if we can live our lives with that kind of a flow, well, what this has to do with me is the ocean of spirit is coming through this little trap door right now. And as long as this is the conduit for who I am, then we have to fulfill the conditions of who I am. But think how fearlessly we can do that. I saw a movie which was in every other way forgettable, but it had this one fantastic point in it that I loved. It was about American Indians, and it was just this, it was like this 3-hour agonizing story as one by one all the American Indians are killed, they're pursued relentlessly by the white men, and it just never stopped. And of course you knew it wasn't going to stop till every one of them was wiped out. And there was one noble Indian in this, and they sort of gave you a picture of the fact that many times in this man's life, he'd had a dream or a vision, and it was this sort of island floating in a river, and there was characteristics about it. And then finally, in their last desperate effort to escape the white man, suddenly the man is looking right at the actual island in the river, the one he's seen so many times. And suddenly it occurs to him that this is where he's going to leave his body. This is the place of his death. And he realizes that there was no chance that he would die in his life. He'd never understood the dream. And now he suddenly understood it, that he was being shown the place of his death. And he realized that there was no chance that he could have died until he came to that island. And he said, he lamented this way. Ah, he said, if I had only realized that, what a brave warrior I would have been. And that's always been in the back of my mind. What a brave warrior I would have been if I had known that death is going to come to me, but not today. But I would like to reverse that a little bit. Maybe we don't know when we're going to leave our bodies. Maybe we have a prediction. Maybe we have an intuition. But whatever it is, the cycle of our life is going to run itself exactly as it's going to run itself. And why not be brave warriors every step of the way? What is it that we really have to lose? When we die, everything goes away. This, for me, was an enormously powerful incentive on the spiritual path. I've always had this very affectionate relationship with death, is the only way I can call it. I've never considered the subject even slightly morbid. I've considered it exhilarating. That's the only words I can use. It just seems thrilling to me to realize that we just inhabit these bodies for a little bit of time and then we go on to another reality, that this story is so expansive. Someone, a Buddhist monk who was asked about reincarnation, made a wonderful statement, which I love. He said, you think of one incarnation and the next incarnation and the time in between as a series of separate events. He said, there's nothing separate about it at all. He said, it is one continuous flow of energy. Well, back to where I was talking about my mother dying when I was in Rome with Swamiji, and he was talking about death. And he just said so simply, he said it very emphatically, but very simply, nothing happens when you die. Nothing. He said nothing happens because who we are is consciousness. We are not this physical body. That's why Swamiji said, just because my body was laying there, what does that have to do with me? The me, the I, the infinite, even whatever level, whether we're talking ego or divine spirit, whatever it is, it just wears this for a while. It wears this personality. It wears this series of intense issues that we take so personally just for a while. And then it just all resolves itself into stillness. The thought of that, it's, of course, you see, that's exactly what we're doing when we're meditating. And when we meditate, that idea is so attractive, isn't it? It's just so attractive in this rushing world with so many different forces pulling on us. We sit to do our kriyas and we try as best we can to pull our energy right into the spine and to become absolutely still. And we understand what a deeply desirable state that is, don't we? And every time we come anywhere near it, either in a moment of inspiration, in the middle of a kriya breath, in a kirtan, in a prayer, walking in nature, wherever it touches us, whenever we come close to it, it's so thrilling. And it's so nurturing. And it puts everything else in perspective. And you see, of course, that's just the little I die daily. The really big one, where we get to shed the body, we have is what Swami calls the final exam. We get to find out how we really did for this whole cycle, and then we get to go on. And of course, death itself, as Swamiji said, nothing happens. Which is, if you're a selfish, unhappy person, you get to be a selfish, unhappy, dead person. That's all. Really, you don't really become a saint. When my mother passed away, I had 3 dreams of her. And the first one, because she'd been ill so long, I think the thought of being ill was so strongly in her mind that even though she was dead, I don't think she knew she was dead. I think she was in the astral hospital. At least that's where I saw her. And my mother was very suspicious of other people, toward the end especially, and she always wanted me to be there to do things for her. She had me fly all the way from Northern to Southern California once to call the dentist to make an appointment. I didn't know that's why she was calling me. She made me believe it was an important situation. It turned out I was supposed to just call the dentist. But anyway, she came to me in a dream, and she's sitting on the side of a bed, like a hospital bed. She's still very elderly and still very bent over. And she's sort of like looking around her to make sure no one is listening. And she said, "There's some things I need for you to do." It was just a complete replica of the last years of her life. "There's some things I need for you to do." I said, "Mom, I think there's lots of really good people here who could help you." "I'm not so sure," she says like this. I said, "Mom, but I think it's fine." So I kind of, touched her and blessed her, and then I backed away from her. The second time she came, now I've started. Second time she came, she looked very young and very beautiful. And again, I'm dreaming. My father's still living. She comes, and she just looks wonderful, and I'm just so happy to see that now she's let go of that old body. And she's come to see my father, because they were very attached, 56 years kind of marriage. And so she goes with my father into their room, and they shut the door. And then after a few minutes, I hear her calling my name. She seems very concerned, and I open the door, and she's aging right in front of me. She's losing her young form right there. And I just sort of pulled her up, and I pushed her out of the room. This is all in a dream, but it was very real. I pushed her out of the room. I said, "It's much too soon for you to be here. You have to go away." And then I woke up. Then the third time I saw her, she looked, my favorite picture of her is her engagement picture with my father when she was 24. And she's standing at a window, and she's that age again, and she just looks so young and so beautiful and so happy. And then I knew that it was, that it was done. She was really free. Nothing happens, you see, when you die. You just have to keep on with whatever it is that you need to learn. Last, just interesting, because I'm on my parents. My sister and my brother and I are all oversensitive. We all have a capacity to kind of feel energy and a little bit more than the average way. After my father died, which was 2 years after my mother, the day after he died, all three of us talked to each other for the first time about the fact that in the 2 years that my father was living and my mother was on the other side, whenever we would think about my mother, there was always a little agitation. The day after my father died, all three of us felt her to be completely at peace. I think she was trying to get that man to her the whole time, and he was just kind of having a good time. His mind was a little gone, but he was in a real happy place. He had friends, It had been kind of hard at the end because she was ill, and so he was just taking a little holiday. That's what my father looked like to me. He was just taking a little holiday before he went back into the process of being himself. Nothing happens when you die. But everything happens when you die, because you get to keep being exactly who you are. And if that's not a really special treat, death doesn't make it any better. It doesn't, in fact, Swamiji says, when the body goes away, and the body has a deadening influence because it's so coarse by compared to the vibration of consciousness, that whatever we are becomes intensified, which means that our goodness of heart also becomes intensified. I think that's why, for those of you who saw the Finding Happiness movie, when I talked about my friend Paula passing, as soon as her soul was released from the body, this enormous, enormous rush of powerful energy just passed over me, and I felt like that was her body letting go. There's a wonderful story about Paula also, who had a near-death experience before she died. She wasn't sick at the time she had this. She was kind of a flowy kind of person. She didn't keep track of details a lot. And she used to be a buyer for this store that we had, women's clothing and gifts. She was very, very good at it. She could just pick things up. She had a really excellent sense of it. So she was in New York City, I think, at some big show buying things for our store. And she had a bad cough, and she had codeine cough syrup, but instead of measuring it out carefully, she was just sipping it periodically. And she sipped a good bit too much of it. And she was in her hotel room all by herself, and she was beginning to die from an overdose of this narcotic medicine. And she sort of felt herself, she saw the tunnel of light, she felt herself going into the tunnel of light. She kind of crawled into the bathroom. She had this thought somehow if she put water on her face, it would bring her back. She was actually, as she put it, kind of leaning over the open toilet bowl. And she was looking into the toilet bowl. She had enough consciousness left to think, oh God, am I going to die looking into the toilet bowl? It was just like, what an undignified place to be. It was not the picture she had in her mind. But there she was, and she was going out in the tunnel of light. She didn't have any fear of death, but it was a bit unexpected to be dying from codeine cough medicine. She said she was moving in the tunnel of light, and she remembered a particular outfit that she had bought for herself that afternoon and hadn't picked up yet. And it just appeared to her, when she remembered it, she came back out of the tunnel of light. It brought her back to life. To me, it wasn't clear whether she should go and buy it and enshrine it and worship it for the rest of this incarnation. I asked her, and I said, did you buy it? She said, not a chance. She went and canceled the order just like that. But you see, nothing happens when we die. The same things that distract us in meditation, the same things that pull on our hearts, that take us away from our ability to come into that calmness, you just get to keep on doing it. There's no break. There's no real break. We do get to rest a bit in the astral world, maybe. And Swamiji once remarked after we visited Hawaii, he said, before the white people came and brought influenza and all the things that they brought, he said, incarnated in Hawaii, where you didn't have to work, you could just eat the coconuts and the fish, and the climate was perfect, and there really was very little illness or disease. He said you would incarnate there when you really weren't quite ready to incarnate. You weren't really coming completely out of the astral world to live there. But otherwise, we hang out in the astral world for a while. We get to enjoy the company of like-minded souls. The nice thing about the astral worlds is that they're homogeneous. This planet, as you well know, is a bit of a mixed bag. You know, we have all kinds of vibrations just existing right next to each other. People of very evil and low consciousness are just standing right next to very elevated souls. The relief of the astral world is that you're only in your own vibration. You can't go higher. You can go lower to help, but you can't go higher. But at least whatever it is, it's yours. Now, of course, if you're a good person, that's really nice. If you're not, it's not. You get to be exactly what you really are. Now, all of us with spiritual aspirations don't have to fear, but hell is real. But hell is just people who are living in it now. People who are being evil now, who are closing their hearts now. They just get to keep doing more of it. And nothing lasts forever, because sooner or later our own longing for bliss just takes us forward. I had a friend, and I believe his gift was real. It was a very unusual gift, but I believe that he really did what he did. For some reason, he could go into a space, and sometimes, and the dynamics of this are completely obscure to me, so I'm just talking far out stuff here that I can't really explain. But he would clear the houses or the apartments where people lived, because sometimes there were astral beings that were still inhabiting that space. Now, that's where I can't figure out exactly how that works. But here's a fascinating story of who he found in my apartment. There was a certain spot in my apartment that always seemed to have what I called it, well, I'm going to use a double entendre here, had a kind of dead energy to it. There was just something in that spot. It wasn't evil, it was just odd. It was always kind of like there was a hole in the room right there. And he said, he came in and he did his thing to clear it. And this is what he said he found there. He found an American Indian, a warrior, who was there on his horse, and he had been in one of those horrible last battles with the white man, and his daughter had been killed And he was so just heartbroken, both because she had died and also because he had been unable to protect her, that he was absolutely stuck right there. That he had eventually been killed himself, but he died with such a sense of despair over what he perceived to be his failure that who knows how long he was still somewhere in some vibration in my apartment. Now, what this man also said is that just above this warrior was his daughter. And she had died, but she had accepted her death. It was what had to happen. And she did not feel, as he did, this enormous sense of despair. She was perfectly willing to go on. And she was trying to get his attention. She was trying to get him literally to look up and see her there. Now, whether this is true or apocryphal, it doesn't matter because it tells us a lot of what we want to know. And somehow my friend, with his abilities to be between the two worlds, was able to just get that man's attention enough so he looked up and saw his daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he let go of the state of mind that was holding him there, and he went forward toward her. And then the whole energy began to shift. Now, we're describing, perhaps in less dramatic terms, exactly the project that all of us are facing, which is when it's time to just turn the page, either for ourselves or for the people that we have really enjoyed being with in this lifetime. And we can't think for a moment that God doesn't understand how much we love each other and enjoy this project. When Swami Kriyananda 10 years ago, it was actually just before he felt inspired to move to India, which was a little more than 10 years ago, 2003 in November. He had finished writing Conversations with Yogananda, and he was really thinking that it might be the end of his life. He just sort of didn't see where it was going. And he was unwell a lot of the time, and we were talking on the phone one evening, and he just mentioned that the night before, what he described really was that everything about his consciousness came to such a still point. That was almost exactly how he put it. Just everything just came to such a still point. He said it would have been so easy just to slip out of his body at that point. And I had to say, and truthfully, whenever you're ready to go, sir, we're not going to even, not even going to send a thought that you should stay behind. You've done everything you could do. We can't ask more of you. And then, but I had to add, honestly, I said, but, you're what makes life on this planet bearable. The fact that you periodically reappear in my life physically and just make it work, or call on the phone or send an email or whatever, you make it bearable. It's not going to be any fun to be on this planet after you're gone. And he answered me so seriously. He said, I know, I've been through it. And he was talking, of course, about Master's passing. And Master's passing was when he was 25. He had 3.5 years with Master. And, all of his life, 60, more than all those other years after, were after Master had gone. But he said, I know, I've been through it. The defining reality is taken away. Now, whether that's your guru, your wife, your baby, your sister, who it might be, all of us have these relationships that become our defining reality. And we have to say with all honesty, it's not the same after they're gone. Even Master wept tears after Sister Gyanamata died, because there had been this, as he put it, this unique relationship. They would never be Sister Gyanamata and Paramhansa Yogananda again. And there'd been just something so exquisite about that. And now it was gone. So the other side of death and dying is that the flower blooms, and while it's blooming, it's just breathtakingly beautiful. But then, of course, the flower also passes. And do we enjoy the flower less because sooner or later it passes? Or do we understand that nothing really changes? That the forms that we live in and the forms that we love each other as. Just as Swamiji said to me, "Sir, I saw your body there for all those days. What does that have to do with me?" And so you really have to stop and think, what does it have to do with him? What were we really experiencing? I mean, it wasn't the physical molecules that made him valuable. Even in our love relationships with each other, even though we hug each other and admire the way we look and think that our husband is handsome and our baby is the cutest baby ever and our son is so manly and our wife so elegant and all of those things. But what does that really have to do with anything? I was looking out the window of a hotel I was staying in Mumbai when I first arrived in India a few weeks ago. And there was a wedding outside. And I love fabric, I love fashion, and I love the way Indian women look when they're so dressed up and beautiful. But for some reason, this particular wedding, and maybe it was just the view out the window, there were lots of really beautiful women in really beautiful clothes. But for the first time, I was aware of the fact that when a woman is wearing a really beautiful dress, it doesn't do anything. It just sits there, and she walks around in it. And it doesn't talk, it doesn't sing, it can't meditate, it doesn't realize God, it can't love you back, it can't make witty remarks, it just sits there. And of course, it's beautiful, it gives upliftment if it's really beautiful, it's art if it's really done well. But I really started thinking about the physical bodies that we live in, which are just under that beautiful dress. And it really doesn't do anything. It doesn't make witty remarks. It doesn't really love us back either, even though we think it does. And it is not really the definition of our destiny. Swamiji made such an interesting remark about parenthood, because parents become very concerned about their responsibility for their little ones. And Swamiji said, the mother and the father provide the vehicle through which the soul can express its destiny. He said, but the parents create neither the soul nor the destiny. That pre-exists. And then the parents create the physical body through which the soul can express its destiny. But the body just stays there, and the more easily we can just kind of live in these forms enthusiastically and with great respect, but always with just that little bit of a feeling that it's not really what I love, and it's not even really who I am. It's just what I'm carrying around for a while. I once had to put a new carpet into our apartment. And because of the carpet, the color we wanted, and various things like that, it became a huge deal. And all the community was sort of involved, because our home is like the community center. And so there was just this great hoo-ha to get this carpet, to get it delivered, to get it installed, all these things. Finally, the big day was there, and the whole carpet was spread out. And its apartments are wonderful because there's nothing in them, and we all have wall-to-wall carpeting there. I'm sitting in the apartment with nothing but the carpet. I'm alone in the apartment, and I'm trying really hard to get some happiness out of this carpet. And that was when I realized it was an inert object. It had absolutely no consciousness, and it had no capacity to love me, none, no matter how much I flattered it. It could do absolutely nothing for me. And I thought, how many times in my life do I look at something that can do absolutely nothing for me and imagine that it can love me back? we can love each other. Don't make a mistake here. We can love each other very, very deeply. And in fact, Swamiji writes in the chapter in his autobiography, The New Path, when he's talking about Master's passing, and he's talking about the spiritual family, and he's talking about how these great souls arise and reincarnate over and over, and how other souls are drawn to them, and then many great stars of self-realization build up in the family. And then all of us just keep seeing each other again and again. But he says something in there extremely profound. And he states that in these spiritual families, we work out our self-realization not only inwardly with God, but also outwardly through our relationships with one another. That's really quite a statement when you think about it. Which is to say that how we love each other and who we understand each other to be is a fundamental part of our God realization. And so that's why it's very, very important to understand life and death, because we're going to be meeting each other again and again in the astral world, in the physical world. Swamiji said once, one of the reasons that the Ananda communities essentially come together so well, with so much harmony and so much sort of instinctive understanding of how to be together, rather than the necessity for big rule books and training courses, is because we've been together many times in the astral world. We've had these communities, we've had these sanghas in the astral world together, and then we just move into physical manifestation when the masters need us to be here, and then we busy ourselves trying to make it happen again. In whatever form we try to make it happen again. So our bodies come and go, but that which is really us just unites with each other, unites with spirit, and ultimately unites with God. You know, Swamiji sets the standard for us. Just the ocean of spirit, the little opening, just moving in to that absolute stillness and just letting it go just as easily as we can drop just a piece of paper in our hand. You know, that's where we need to be. And we do that effortlessly because we know nothing has happened. That everything that we are, everything we are with God, everything we are with one another, just moves on seamlessly in the direction that the river flows to the sea until our realization is complete. So, God bless you. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, I would be happy to answer them. Yes, sir?
Can I take you home?
I am home here. I would be delighted. I would be delighted to know all of you much better. And with the grace of God over time, I will. Yes?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question. My brother passed away last month. My brother. He was only 44 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the exact reason why it happened, because he was not taking food. He said, I'm doing some sadhana, and he was not taking food for 30, 40 days. And so he did it 3 times. And we took him to different hospitals 3 times, and he was taking food there, but when we brought him home, he didn't take anything. And so lastly he died. And the reason was he was not taking food.
Wow.
So I don't know whether he was destroying himself or it was natural. So what kind of death it is, I'm not sure.
You know, when my parents were ill, this is not exactly the same, but when my parents were at the end of their life, and so many things about their situation, I had a very hard time expanding into my own understanding. I just couldn't understand exactly what their reality was. But I knew it was the natural next step for their karmic unfoldment, whether wise or not wise, it was just what they were going to do. And so the prayer I found, which I would offer to you for your brother, Divine Mother, whatever it is that he needs to learn, please be with him and give him the strength, the receptivity, the courage, and the wisdom to learn it. Because I think it would be impossible to know what the complexity of his inner reality was that would cause those circumstances. But the main point is, whatever it is that he's trying to learn, just pray to Divine Mother that she help him learn it. You can add to it what I added to my prayer, and do it really well and do it soon. I mean, he's already passed from this world, so you're not looking at him anymore. With my parents, I was uncomfortable. But just whatever distress you may feel in your heart, it's all right to demand of Divine Mother that she do something about this and make it clear to you, how you can help. Our incarnations are so complicated. What you're describing is a very complicated karma. Either he was acting exactly for his highest good, or he was in some way confused and a little bit in a cul-de-sac. And unless you receive a divine revelation, you can't know. But the point now is that whatever it is, Divine Mother, help him to progress. And put his name on all the prayer lists. Ananda has lots of prayer lists so that everybody can send him energy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Certainly. Any other questions? Yes.
What would be your thoughts on euthanasia?
Euthanasia. My feeling is that we don't know what the soul is doing in those last hours, days, years. We really don't know how much karma can actually be worked out in that period of time. I certainly felt with my parents, and my aunt and my uncle, I sort of saw them all at the end of long lives, that what looked slightly distressing to me or to others, I'm not at all sure it was either distressing to them or unimportant. All the decisions of a lifetime, come to a head in those last moments, however long they are, relatively speaking. And I would be very hesitant to make a deliberate decision to end that. Of course, it would be the karma of the person if you did. To not follow heroic measures, to not force feed someone, to not, to not put in a feeding tube or not put on a ventilator. That to me is different. When the body is ready to go, you can just let it go. But to cut it out of anxiety about what that last period might be, seems to me potentially to do the soul a great disservice. And I know, but individuals who are thinking like that don't know about karma. They don't know about self-transcendence. There's so many things they don't know. So I would be very, very hesitant to put that in place. Also, the soul and the body separate a lot, and what we think of as really, what looks really awful to us, sometimes if the person comes back out of that state, they were experiencing it quite differently. And so we can't just judge from the outside what's really going on. And sometimes a long period of debility that's just what a person needs to resolve, to reflect, to resolve. Because if you die without having reflected and resolved, you just have to do it all over again. Now is the moment to really look at it, when it's right there fresh, and you have a God-given opportunity to really release. And to just cut that process off seems unfortunate at best. So I would certainly not speak of it. To stop trying to save a person's life when clearly the body is over, that I would favor easily, and I would call that something different. I had to be present when the life support system was disconnected for a man. I guess I talked to you about that the last time I was standing here. And he had, 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, his life ended. And he was fully conscious and just very brave, very calm, very brave. Just, okay, it's been a good story now, it's over. I was so impressed, really, really impressed. Anything else? Yes, sir.
You are very compassionate, despite the fact that you know that nothing changes. But it does tend to, people do tend to become less compassionate if you know that karma is going to be there anyway, and nothing changes. So you don't really care. A lot of people wouldn't care about helping somebody or...
No, when I say nothing changes, by that I mean you don't get a free ride just by dying. That's what I meant by it. You take your consciousness with you. But everything can change if you change your consciousness. So the compassion is just based on the fact that in this world, in the astral world, in the next incarnation, whatever project you're going to have to work on, you're just going to have to keep working on it. And when you add to that the fact that we're spiritual brothers and sisters and we're just going to all see each other again, and we're all in this together, it just, in fact, it makes you more committed, you see, because it never ends. We're just going to have to work all of this out, and we're all going to have to get free. So you pay less attention to the little movements, but you become much more committed to the long movement. Yeah. Samakshi?
There was this, I think in one of Swamiji's books, there's this something he talks about where the thought that you hold at the moment of death is what can determine to a large extent where you're born in your next life or with what attitude. And I was just trying to, how does that weigh in with all the habits you set in your life or the challenges you face? Does it all just come down to that one moment?
I think that's slightly overstating it. I don't think God is that cruel. Oh, look, there's a mosquito flying around the room. Whap, that's it. But the fact is, whatever our consciousness is at the moment of passing would be a truer way to say it. And what our consciousness is at the moment of passing is the sum total of everything that we've done up until now. Paula was heading down the tunnel and the thought of the dress she was going to buy pulled her out of it. What are we really thinking of? Oh, I don't want to leave my mother. People literally think of things like, but I just moved into my new house. Or I'm so upset because so-and-so's been so unkind to me, or I failed my daughter. Just all of these things. Do we really want to just go on like that? Or do we want to, in that moment when our consciousness elevates, realize, oh, Divine Mother's been in charge of this story the whole time, and now's the time for me just to go into the light. When my friend died of cancer, she was less than 50, beautiful home, beautiful children, just really invested in the world. And she had cancer for a number of years. It was always going to end in death. But the final day when the doctor told her there was nothing more she could do, just intuitively I went to see her house. I didn't know that's what the day was. And she looked at me like this and she said, I know it sounds silly, but I always thought I was going to get well. All evidence to the contrary. But then she looked at the home and, the children were not that old. They were adults, but not that old. She said, how can I leave all this? And then she began to cry. And I told her, I said, it's going to be a wall of tears right now. You're going to have this wall of fire, actually, is what I said, just fiery tears. And you're going to have to walk right through it, and it's going to be very, very difficult. But on the other side, you'll find freedom. And so I just stayed with her, and we went through that. And, a few weeks later, and it wasn't too much long later, she was on her deathbed. And she just looked at me with this blissful smile, and she said, you were right. It was a wall of fire, but also at the end, you were right. So that's what those hours, that's what that time gives us. Somebody might have wanted to, quote, save her the suffering, but she really went through it and just died beautifully, just with a beatific smile on her face, and, released her husband to have another marriage and another life, which he has gone on to do, and with her blessing, just let it all go. One more death, and then I'm going to stop. This woman, Bella, was dying, and she was also leaving. She was very young. She was leaving a husband, a home, and all those things. And She was on the last days of her life, and a friend came and was sitting with her, and she said, as I lie here, Bella said, as I lie here, she said, I see thousands of faces going in front of me, and I realize that every one of them is an incarnation that I have lived. She said, it just, what should I cling to with such a realization? And then, of course, she just let the whole thing go. But while she was there, she was fully in it. But now it's time to just move on. And you see, I'm not going to stretch the point because it's too late, but with that attitude, you see, everything in our life can just be like that. We just want to be in right relationship to everything, because we never know. You really never know. People die so suddenly. Friends is running. He says, oh, I don't feel so well. He sits down on the curb. He's gone. Swami Kriyananda, of course, we anticipated. Another friend of mine, he got up in the night to walk into the bathroom. He stepped from the bedroom into the bathroom, but instead went into the astral world. So I like to keep my accounts current. That's how I think about it. I want to be current every day, because if I breathe in and then I breathe out and it's the last time, I don't want to be carrying a lot of baggage with that breath. And it just makes everything just lines up, just like that. Here we are. Well, I think that is enough for this evening. God bless you all.